much and for the warm welcome and invitation. Just to check, can we all see that screen okay?
Fine. Yeah.
Brilliant. So yeah, I'm very excited to be talking to you, everybody, today about some of the work that I've been undertaking for the last few years in Oxfordshire. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at the work that we've been doing at FarmEd today, where we have been utilising a quite novel methodology called ecological energetics or energetic accounting to try and understand some of the changes that have been made under their regenerative agriculture, specifically their arable rotation regime. And we're hoping that we might be able to develop this further into something that could be used for possible nature recovery comparison across sort of above and below ground environments. So this is really sort of a first operational step in the UK to really understand what this looks like, and specifically for the soil environment as well. Very kindly supported by the Centre for High Carbon Capture Cropping, as well as the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery, of course, where I've been situated in this research. And we've also with supervisors at Kew Gardens. So fortunately, I'm very well supported in what we're doing. But to get started, just I know everybody sort of knows, but to give us a little bit of a background, obviously this is the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery, and we work as an interdisciplinary centre in order to be able to try and find the best solutions to some of the nature and the biodiversity crisis that we're facing. We're taking an interdisciplinary approach, and obviously we have many different themes and packages that we utilise in order to be able to do this. So whilst I sit in the ecology side of things, we also have, and you've met a few of our members today on the call who are situated in some other areas of the centre, bringing together lots of different ideas really to try and encourage that societal change and that transformation that we need. So we have sort of brought together this definition, this interdisciplinary definition, in order to do this, and really have decided that it is about our relationships with the earth, and specifically repairing the human relationship with the rest of the natural world, which is the way that we believe will be able to encourage and catalyze change for nature recovery that we really need to see. And this, I think, is actually a really lovely and more holistic definition than some of the more ecological ones that I might, for example, promote, and others may promote from their points of view. And we believe that this is something that really helps encapsulate all of those different values from all of those different all of those different sectors that we need to represent. But specifically from the ecology side of things, we have a remit within the centre to start understanding the effectiveness of different ecological approaches that could bring about nature recovery. And we really are focusing on very novel and quite kind of boundary pushing ideas that we hope could create some quite quick wins in this space. Also, there's some quite large risks there. So there are obviously bits and pieces that we need to refine along the way, but it's about trying to take those larger steps in order to be able to quite quickly find ways forward to do a lot of the imperative work that we need. And specifically in this case, I'm trying to understand, can we try and develop tools that can monitor and compare nature recovery in various environments and places nationwide? So to set the scene, as we always unfortunately must do, we do have a problem in this country. We are one of the world's most nature depleted countries, and I know that is a statistic that is harped on a lot, but I do think that it's really important that we recognize that and try and reverse that as quickly as possible. There are huge numbers of cascades that are then invoked because of this problem, mostly around sort of missing ecosystem actors and therefore missing functions that we might have in our environment. We are a heavily managed environment, and the vast majority of the country is managed by humans. So we really need to be quite careful with the way in which we sort of restart, let's say, those ecosystem functions and reintroduce those actors that can provide those functions for us, and think about the best ways that we can do this in very heavily populated, and dense landscapes. I'm not under any impression that, and I would never advocate for the sort of extirpation or the movement of people out of the landscape, and as sort of in the spirit of the definition of the centre, we very much want to find ways that we make these things coexist, and we ensure that we serve both the needs of people and nature. You know, people are very much a part of nature when we're trying to do this work. So understanding sort of the background in the UK, many of us here will sort of really have this already, but 71% of the UK's farmland area is designated farmland, and 70% of that farmland is actually pastures. But we're going to be focusing on the other 30% at the moment, which is looking at the arable lands, which are some of our most degraded landscapes in the country. Now, these are landscapes that have continuously sort of been disturbed and more recently degraded, which I'll talk about in a minute. But a lot of this story is down to land use change and landscape fragmentation. So when you sort of see on the right-hand panel here, the bottommost square being, let's say, an intact environment, theoretically, the sort of increasing carving up of that landscape through the land use change, such as the creation of farms, does sort of introduce barriers to a lot of the biodiversity on the landscape, whether that be sort of physical movement barriers, genetic barriers, resource exchange barriers, the introduction of pollutants, etc. And over time, we create these islands, and these islands are ones that can't then really sort of exchange a lot of that information and a lot of that need with other areas, and slowly over time start degrading. And this is a lot to do with what we've seen in sort of terms of our biodiversity decline in the UK, amongst other reasons. We also, post-World War II, have seen an intensification of agriculture, and this has very much come along with technological development around the time, the transition of a lot of the chemical weapons companies into pesticides and other sort of chemical companies, and the advent of a huge sort of boom in machinery. And then this has had a knock-on effect in terms of sort of landscape structure. So we've had to remove huge amounts of hedgerows and other parts of the landscape that were sort of buffering that fragmentation I previously spoke about, and have created large areas of genetically identical monocultures. Which is not a sort of traditional approach or one that would be advocated for pre this time. And we'll talk about mixed use farming and some of the impacts a bit later on. And this is obviously what has led to some of the issues that we see in terms of, let's say, the Wye Valley, and you have the huge amounts of pollution that are entering the rivers there from the chicken farms, drift and sprays, soil degradation, soil erosion, etc. So it's not exactly the best backdrop, but let's get on to some greener pastures. So yeah, why are we looking at this really, and why are we applying this to the soil system? Now you can see here on the right a really interesting image that's been generated by ChatGPT when you ask it about soils and what a black box of a soil might mean. But really, this is quite indicative of the the lack of knowledge that we have about these places. They are physically really difficult for us to look into. They are dense, they are opaque, they are deep, and they are entire ecosystems. So it's something that we really have very, very little knowledge about, and we are still thinking about with concepts that we apply to above ground systems, which do start to fall apart below ground, and especially within the microbial realm. So there are some basic questions here that we really don't understand. We don't know the where, the why, the what, the how. And we hope that applying an energetics framework will be able to start elucidating some of these changes without having to physically observe them, which is something that we find quite exciting. Now, so the way I sort of like to sort of describe the soil system, and I know that here it's very much capitalized on the left, the soil is an ecosystem. I like to imagine a drone flying above a rainforest. And the type of view that you get looking down, you're seeing all the tops of the canopies. This is sort of essentially and the opaqueness below that. This is essentially the view that you're achieving when you're looking down on a piece of soil. The scale at which we're operating is so vastly different to what we're used to in the human world that we really need to basically put ourselves in that bird's eye view place, that place of having a much larger sort of perspective over the things that we're looking at. And we can just about start to understand the diversity, the complexity, and the different structures that make up such an incredible system. So bringing this all together and trying to take us out of some of those more negative mindsets into one that's more optimistic, we need a vision for successful conservation in the UK. And this is something that I've been thinking about and working on throughout my PhD, and thinking about how I'm going to weave the papers that I'm working into a narrative that really is hopeful and one that can help contribute to nature recovery. So this is very much in the spirit of thinking about the landscape in the UK as one that should be a patchwork matrix of different types of land uses that can serve the needs of biodiversity, whether it be providing different habitats and homes, or the food and genetic resources that they need to survive. We've been thinking about that through a various number of different land uses that we've been investigating. So, for example, my first paper was focused on rewilding at the Nep estate. And I'll show a little bit more of some of this, or touch upon this work in a second. But really about having those cores and those corridors. So understanding the core areas where some of that more specialist biodiversity needs to be situated, as it requires more specific conditions that can't be provided by those corridors, which are more littoral or linear habitats that have maybe a little less ecological complexity and might be a bit more shared with sort of their human neighbors, but together allow for that connectivity and for that movement across really the regenerative agriculture here serves as a part of those corridors. And is part of this wider vision for a way in which we might create a very lively and flourishing landscape in the future. Now, that's what I've settled on for sort of the theme of the PhD. So we are sort of investigating all of these different land uses that could possibly contribute to future nature recovery. But as I am interested in the soil, it is all from obviously a soil ecological perspective. So looking at the paper structure, just before we sort of touch upon what we're going to be talking about today, which is paper 3, the first paper, as I mentioned, looked at rewilding at the Nep estate and really understanding individual taxonomic responses to those nature recovery activities. So specifically, we are also trying to understand the correct scale at which we need to investigate these systems in order to be able to have a more holistic view of some of the change that has been generated, and also understanding some of the things that we're missing by not having that view. So each paper here takes an increasingly larger scale view of the system that it's investigating in order to try and give some of that context, as we have such little idea of what's actually happening below ground. The second paper then starts to look at the total community in the soil through a respiration technique. And essentially what that means is that we are utilizing sort of the efflux, so the output of CO2, which is a proxy for all of the activities and metabolism of the organisms in the soil. And we're able to directly measure that efflux with some very clever equipment. And that is sort of what makes up the second paper of this PhD, really understanding if we can take enough and garner enough information just from sort of monitoring the total activity of the community. And finally, now in the third paper, we're really trying to investigate and really understand what we're missing by basically taking a cross section of the entire soil system at specific points of time, really to then give us the information and pick out some of the key pieces that we might be able to utilize in future to, let's say, develop more streamlined tools that could be able to do this in a more efficient way. This is quite a large undertaking, I know, and you'll see why in a second. But first, where are we based? So we are based just to the northwest of Oxford at Farmed in the lovely Cotswolds. And if you've not visited there before, I would really recommend it, as it's a fantastic agroecological demonstration site where they've transformed a traditional sort of arable wheat system, I think it was a wheat rape system, into a flourishing mixed farm, which I now think believes employs 3 or 4 times as many people as it ever did as a farm. Has a fantastic cafe conference center on site to encourage that discussion and engagement between different members of this food system community. And they also have a brilliant number of different spaces to explore and freely walk around to understand some of the transformative change that could be made through regenerative agriculture. So some of those include, for example, a CSA market garden, spin out into its own business, regenerative pastures, heritage orchards, various sort of experimental plots that you see across site, as well as that mixing in with some of those core activities I mentioned previously. So rewilding areas such as a rewilded water retainment system across the site and scrubland, wildflower meadows, etc. But specifically, we are going to be focusing on this part up here, which is the regenerative arable rotation. And each strip in this rotation represents a year or a normal year of operation within one field. So you have all 8 years. This is an 8-year rotation on one hillside, and each strip every year changes to the next step in the rotation. So what this actually provides us is a really fantastic way to condense that 8 years of research into one and really try and understand what's happening to the ecology through these changes. And I'll also mention as to why I'm so focused on the ecology in a second, as I think this is a key lever for achieving some of this change that we need and some of the fertility and soil health aspects for crop growth and nutritious food. We also have, very fortunately, a control plot on site. So we're able to actually completely contrast all of the results that we're taking from the arable rotation with a control plot which experiences the same conditions as everything else on site. So we really have a nice comparison to be able to say, okay, this is what it was before and this is what it's like afterwards. And this control plot is minimally tilled, as that is sort of the norm for the area because of the very thin soil depth, but is sprayed and fertilized as you would expect with what you would associate with chemical farming. Now, I've mentioned the term regenerative agriculture a lot. It's not one that everybody is familiar with, and is an interesting concept because it's unlike organics, is not a set of prescriptive rules that you have to undertake in order to become, let's say, an organic farmer or become organic land. This is very much around principles that you would like to sort of follow and adapt to your local situation and context. Specifically, there are 5 principles that are very much focused on sort of soil intervention improvements, and ones that are quite low in their intensity. So, for example, we want to make sure that we're having as diverse inputs vegetation-wise to the soil. So we want to be thinking about trying to diversify the types of plants that we're putting in. If that can't be different types of crops, that can we increase the genetic diversity within crops using heritage varieties of crops, for example. Keeping living roots in the soil, making sure that we're having some form of, here it says livestock, but some form of organic matter inclusion. So we want to be able to sort of increasingly bolster the resources of all of that below ground biodiversity, or what I might start calling our below ground livestock, which are helping cycle all of those nutrients and create the conditions for successful crop and other product growth. We want to reduce our disturbance, so we want to make sure that we're trying to retain all of that soil structure that's being produced by that biodiversity. And again, we're trying to make sure the soil is covered at all times. So we're not leaving fields fallow, we're not leaving them brown, let's say. We're making sure that we're either covering them with something like a herbal ley or a cover crop in times of when they aren't being farmed, in order to make sure that we're reducing the impact of for example, wind and rain on the soil, which can obviously erode and degrade it. Now, we've thought a lot about sort of the biology of the soils, and the focus obviously here is very much on the ecology, as we are the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery. However, there is also another reason why we're focusing so heavily on this, and this is to do with the fact that there has been increasing amounts of research recently that is showing that the biology is the sort of key mediator of the soil system and are able to slowly change the parameters of the soil over time to the point at which it can expand the boundaries that we would have thought would be limited by the physical or the chemical components of the soil. Now, this is really down mostly to the microbes, and the microbes themselves are utilizing sort of the carbon and other compounds in the soil to build sort of their homes, all of the structures, the aggregates that you find, so that crummy texture, which gives the soil sort of the qualia that we associate with it in terms of this health and this fertility. So that allows sort of the nutrients to be cycled, so things are being broken down, they're being used, and they're being actually brought back to the surface for the vegetation to then take up. You also have water infiltration. You get a huge amount of airflow through the soil as well, the oxygenation of the soil, which is really important for all of the biology that lives in there. And then through those mechanisms, you then support larger life in the soil too. So your meso and your macrofauna. Mesofauna being things like collembola, which are springtails, mites, and your macrofauna are like your earthworms, your beetles, your centipedes, etc. And the actions of all of these larger faunas too help create a more healthy and structured soil system. So, for example, you have the tunneling and the burrowing of the worms, which creates all of those, which creates sort of the larger channels, which can then create habitat for the microbes and other things too. So it's all linked in a chain of cascade throughout the system. If anybody is specifically interested in understanding a bit more about this, I would point you to a fantastic paper by Andy Neal, who's a professor at Rothamsted, who has been looking at the microbial metagenome, essentially in relation to the soil, and describes the soil as an emergent property of that microbial community, which I think is a really fascinating perspective to place on the soil. So really, and what we're going to be thinking about when we're doing this work is if we want to improve our soils and we want to improve the health or the fertility, let's say, of those soils, we really have to be focusing on the biology and especially sort of the relationships of all of the different actors in the soil and how they interact with a lot of the crops and the techniques that we utilize. So that is sort of the crux, and we really hope that some of this work is going to start elucidating some of the mechanisms that allows that to happen. So we have started to see some of these impacts already in some other experiments that I've been running at FarmEd, specifically for the Centre for High Carbon Capture Cropping, which is trying to understand the propensity of some of these systems to help with climate change, and the possibility that the storage of that carbon in tissues or in soil could at least temporarily mediate some of the atmospheric carbon and reduce some of the atmospheric carbon load. Now there's various investigations that we're looking at into this, and we are hopefully sort of understanding the limitations of a system such as this. But we have been collecting some really fantastic data around the herbal leys at FarmEd, and that's specifically here the first 4 strips or the first 3.5 strips of this rotation, which essentially acts as the regeneration part of that ley. So putting back in all of the nutrients and all of the structure that may have been removed when you're cropping further along in the rotation. We utilize herbal leys, which are mixtures of about 14 to 17 different species, in order to be able to play off of all of the different variables that their traits of all the different variables of their physiologies. And those physiologies provide different traits that are useful for different actors in the soil. So those might be, for example, different rooting depths and volumes, types of rooting structures, different exudate amounts, so different chemicals they're pumping into the soil through their roots, different sort of chemical compositions of the leaves that when they decompose, they leave different sort of cation, so different chemicals into the soil too. So actually there's lots of different components here that can help build a more resilient system. And that can often lead to something called an over-yielding effect, where you have, for example, all the different traits of all of those plants interacting in order to provide an output that is greater than the sum of its parts, essentially. And now this is something that we've started to see in the above ground biomass at FarmEd on those herbal leys. Now, it's a little bit busy here, but I'll just talk you through it very briefly. What you should know is those rotations that I showed you at FarmEd are on a hillside. So we have split those into the top of the hill and the bottom of the hill. So the top here being dark green and the light green being the bottom. The bottom of the hill has slightly deeper soils than the top, as it's sort of over time been washed down. And what you can see actually is that where you have those deeper soils, the increasing diversity, so from left to right here, you have increasing diversity. So this is your most simple sort of grass clover mixture, and this is your full 17 species ley. The increasing diversity at the bottom of the hill, so in the dark green, at the bottom of the light green, doesn't seem to actually produce it only essentially produces a marginal effect. So you're only seeing a small increase in terms of the above ground biomass, so all of the shoots, by having the increasing diversity when you aren't in a very sort of challenging condition. However, when you start to move towards the top of the hill, you see that the smaller soil depth and sort of that competition for space and resources and nutrients is much greater, and you seem to see this linear increase in the amount of biomass that is being able to be produced by having that increasing diversity. So this is initially showing us already that the combination of all those different traits below ground is supporting all of the biodiversity that is needed in order to produce better outcomes in the soil. So that's our first hint as to sort of the impact of the soil biota here and the impact of having increasing diversity. Now, when we're applying an energetics lens to try and increase sort of the depth of understanding here, we're also trying to understand sort of the longevity of this impact. Now, obviously, energy is sort of a proxy for a measure of work, the ability to do work, essentially move and sort of change sort of structures. And we are utilizing a methodology that has been developed, but we've developed it slightly further by Wacha et al. By focusing just on the biological elements of the soil here, and really trying to try and partition the energy that comes from the sun that hits the plants, that either grows the plants and then they die or they get eaten, and then the incorporation into the soil as organic matter, and then we follow that energy as it goes through all the different trophic levels of the organisms. And we do that by mapping the soil food web of the system and making sure that we have a good understanding, or a good enough, let's say, understanding of the types of interactions that all of the organisms below ground are having. So once we've mapped all of this, we're able to utilize information that we know about these different organisms' metabolisms, as well as all of the information we've collected from in field, to work out where the energy is sort of pooling and flowing through the system, which can be utilized as a proxy for both the function and the composition of the system itself. Now, this is best illustrated in some work Yudvinda produced a few years ago in Borneo, which shows a panel diagram of 3 different environments. So on the left, you have old-growth forest, in the middle, you have logged forest, and on the right, you have oil palm plantation. The size of the circles here corresponds to the amount of energy flowing through a particular group of organisms. And here they've been defined by the things they eat and the types of places they hang out in the environment. Now, we would like to produce something very similar for the soil system, but the main takeaway here is really this illustrative and comparative impact of being able to show how specific changes to a system have changed its energetics. You can see here as well that you have circles that correspond to both species number that are increasing, but as well as energy that's increasing. And these can give us a unified metric for both of these often partitioned measures. Now, the most important thing to take away here is that obviously you can see that in the oil palm plantation, the energetics have collapsed as we've had this complete land use transformation. In logged forest, they're actually slightly higher than that of old growth forests. And that's because the disturbances that have been introduced here have been able to allow more light to penetrate to the floor, increase biodiversity, etc., even as we would see sort of in UK woodlands. And the takeaway from the paper being that we shouldn't write off logged forests for development, as they are still very biodiverse and useful. If you want to put them in that terms. But we would like to produce something similar for the soil environment. Now, we've done this through a set of 3 research questions. So number 1, how is energy partitioned through different soil faunas and their functional morphotypes, so their general sort of activity type, functionally in the soil? Which soil organisms are the most important? So can we identify specific organisms that are able to sort of describe a lot of this activity for us? And how do these flows of energy compare between regenerative rotations and more intensive chemical rotations? So how are we actually farming in those chemical rotations? Are we utilizing sort of all of the free resources and organisms that are out there trying to do this job for us? Or are we doing something completely different? So as you could imagine, we had to collect quite a number of different variables in order to do this work. We've been collecting the NPP of the entire system over 4 seasons last year. Sorry, I should mention that all of this work was repeated 4 times in every season last year in order to have a good understanding of how that changes. We collected a lot about the different types of life that you find in the soil, so all of the different sort of trophic levels that I described, as well as some of the more traditional measures of soils that I call characteristics. So things like the pH, the cations, the nutrients, the diversity, the organic matter levels, etc., the particle sizes. And to try and understand where we can pinpoint and triangulate from all of these different variables some more, some greater efficiencies for the future. Now, what did this really look like in practice? You know, there's lots of different activities here. Well, there were many, many very helpful people who came out to a beautiful site to help me do field work. It took about 2 weeks each time with a team of 5 of us. So it was quite the undertaking. Here you have some research assistants looking for macrofauna in soil pits. We have mesofauna in Tulgren funnels, which we were utilizing to try and capture some of those really small organisms that aren't yet microscopic. And then it was a matter of identifying things. So a huge number of organisms and a huge amount of time went into ID. And I'm very proud to say that I have built up quite the library and knowledge of invertebrate ID as well doing this, which has been fantastic. And we're bringing this all together really now to show you some of the first energetic data that we've been able to garner from these sites, and something that I think is quite exciting too. So the first set I'm going to show you are the mesofauna, and these are all of the invertebrates that are below 2 millimeters in size. Now, this is to say that obviously this is preliminary, and to please not share this yet, as we are sort of still working on this, and I'm bringing it together actually in the moment as we're speaking into a panel diagram, as I showed you previously. But you can see here some very interesting effects. Now, just to give a bit of context to the graphs that we're looking at, so the bottom left-hand corner here, which is described as plot C, is our control. So this is the plot that is chemically farmed, utilizing fertilizers, etc. HLY is our young herbal lay. This is the first year of herbal lay. And HLM is the fourth year, mature herbal lay. HW here describes a heritage wheat crop, which is a crop that is utilizing about 40 different species of wheat instead of a genetic clone or variety, as we usually would see. And this is that lovely sort of tall wheat that's about shoulder head height that blows in the wind in the fields, something that Theresa May loves to talk about running through. Now, we can see here a fantastic effect, and something that I was quite surprised to see myself, specifically within the Collembola. So these are our springtails. And it seems that we're able to start trying to look at them as an indicator species, particularly as they are describing the vast majority, 80 to 90% of the energetic flows through the entire mesofauna community, which I think is something that's really exciting. And it means that in future, we might be able to focus upon this community, for example, to be able to understand change in the soil environment without having to go through all of the steps that I just previously showed you. Now, the next graph I'm going to show you is the macrofauna. And these are anything that's over 2 millimeters in size. So think your worms, your beetles, centipedes, as I previously mentioned. Now we're starting to see, again, a very similar effect. Apologies, we've swapped sides this time. So the control plot is now the bottom right-hand corner. But you can see a similar effect specifically in the annelids and the mollusks. So there is a sort of that larger energetic effect that's flowing through the number of annelids. So all of your worms, your different types of worms that you might find in your field, but specifically in your slugs and your snails as well. Now, these aren't traditionally sort of soil-dwelling organisms. They may be in the top layer or on the surface, but we found a huge number of them, and we thought we should include them, and we'll see if we're going to include them in future. But we have been able to sort of start understanding what this looks like. Now, something that's also really quite interesting here is looking at the spread of that energy. So not only do we have a concentration of energy that's maybe 80, 90% flowing through the annelids in most plots, but in most of the regenerative plots as well, you start to see much greater volumes of energy in some of the smaller groups of organisms. And actually, I've been able to develop this into a log diagram to try and bring out some of those differences a bit more. So not only do we have sort of a concentration effect where we might be able to individually monitor also for this group just the earthworms or the mollusks, we also might be able to look at the spread of that energy to really understand the impact that we're having there. Now, ultimately, I'm going to be bringing this together into something that looks like this, which should be able to start describing in different places the sort of impact that all of those organisms are having, and try and give a good idea of some of that change that we might be instigating through, for example, the diversification in herbal lays, the reduction in pesticides and chemicals. And this is hopefully a bit of a watch this space moment as I try and get this all done for a finish at the end of the year, fingers crossed. Now, in summary, just to wrap up, so obviously we do have sort of the status as one of the world's most nature depleted countries, but this I think is really quite promising and shows us how we have such a great opportunity to do more and to lead in how we sort of lead that land use change. We have seasonal understandings of all of this work, so it's now about digging through the numbers and making sure that we can pick out sort of replicable effects across all of these different places. And we'd really like to sort of simplify this and then spread this out to as many different sites as possible to make sure that we can understand if this is an applicable methodology for lots of different types of environments, as we hope it might be. Now, yeah, I will hopefully be sort of publishing on this a bit later in the year. And yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions. And yeah, please watch this space and this horrible AI image for more. So yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, Jed, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. Really great. I think we're all going to remember where we were the day we first heard the term below ground livestock. So thanks for introducing us to that. I'll open the floor to questions. Jed, maybe you just want to pick people to start off with. Anybody have a question for Jed?
Yeah. Happy to take any. Yes.
There's this argument between the regenerative agriculturalists and the George Monbiot's of this world that we don't want the livestock. Now, I've read the NEP stuff, obviously, and we definitely do want the livestock on a sort of macro scale. I'm rather surprised that you've got the livestock doing stuff within these apparently quite small strip farming things, and don't they just wreck things? And yeah, so when you look at the nutrients overall, although livestock should be, some kind of animals should be part of a natural system, if you've got a field and you've got the animals taking carbon out of the grass and then being taken off and cropped and killed, you've got a net loss in nutrients and carbon. And what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really fantastic sort of discussion to have, actually, and obviously this debate is sort of raging. I don't personally see them actually in antithesis of each other. I think that they can help each other in our understanding, and I think that's unfortunately sort of the politicization of these things that has maybe sort of driven them apart. So I like to think of the livestock that are included on these fields as sort of the replacement ecosystem actors in terms of the proxy, like we see at the Nep estate and other rewilding sites, in terms of sort of bringing back what we would have seen with wild grazers, etc. I'm also simultaneously a big advocate for the less but better meat movement, which would be sort of having these livestock animals on farm, but really utilizing them as sort of members of the farm rather than farmed animals themselves, because they are really a fantastic way to be able to sort of encourage the catalysis of that nutrient cycling. You know, their guts basically act like a biodigester, which can do the composting in a much shorter period of time. And then having that incorporate into the field really accelerates a lot of our processes. So I sort of, yeah, I do advocate for sort of and sorry, just to mention as well for the strips, a mob grazing approach was taken to make sure we don't sort of have too much damage being done to the fields. Obviously, these are very large animals and sort of they will very quickly move through quite a lot of that forage. So I like to try and think about these things sort of in a bit more unity, and that I think there is a bit of an issue in terms of, you know, the UK is 70% pastureland, and we need to sort of understand what we can do with that pastureland, because a lot of it is very unsuitable to dig up for arable cropping. Now, whether that's rewilding a lot of that pasture or trying to keep it in some sort of biodiverse state through managed interventions and low intensity grazing, I'm not sure. But there's definitely a discussion that needs to be considered there about the future of that land use. But I hope that sort of helps answer some of that. Thank you. There's a few, so I'm just going to go from left to right on the screen. So Alison, if you want.
Yeah, really fantastic talk. Thank you. I really enjoyed that. Just a really techie question. I noticed the units on your graphs were kilojoules per square meter or something per year. I just wondered how you actually measure that. Is it measured? Do you literally weigh all the organisms and then sort of burn them and work out what their kilojoule weight is, or do you work out what they eat in a year, or how does it work exactly?
Yeah, so the latter actually. So what we did is we collected all of the organisms, identified them, and weighed them. And then we are at the moment utilizing some proxy measures of metabolism that have been measured from a lot of these organisms in sort of respiration chambers and things over a number of years. Actually, I think there was a big sort of push for this, as Yadvinda mentions, around sort of the 80s, when actually a lot of this work was done and a lot of these individual organisms were sort of measured for their respiration rates. We've applied those to those systems and then sort of utilized the exact weights to get some more difference out of them to get these figures. And essentially, yeah, that gives us our standardized metric of kilojoules per square meter per year, which is quite a weird metric to think about. But I think it's quite nice actually, because it allows us to really sort of understand the volume of energy that's flowing through these places. I've just actually run this analysis, which I haven't included today, on the heterotrophs, so sort of all of the organisms that eat other organisms below ground, and on the mycorrhizal fungi. And the volume of energy that they are processing is an order of magnitude greater than this. So it's pretty incredible to see. Martha.
Thanks, Jed. Yeah, I think you kind of answered my question. I was going to say, I feel like I should know the answer to this, but could you explain what what makes it so useful looking at the energy flow rather than looking at biodiversity and abundance? But I feel like you've sort of answered that question just now, but
No, yeah, I think it's a really good question because obviously we traditionally look at a lot of these systems by either the sort of composition of all the biodiversity that is there or and their abundances or sort of maybe their functions. I quite like energy because it seems to unify those two approaches. So as I previously showed in sort of the panel diagram, whilst we're not sort of extracting specific species information or trying to present it as specific species, we are looking at sort of the general species type and their impact on the environment and the function that they produce. And that is sort of represented by the energy number. I think in the soil system as well, I touched upon it previously, which is that a lot of these concepts start to break down, specifically something like the species concept. So we think about things as very discrete species above ground. You know, you have your cow and you have your hare and you have your red deer. But below ground, a lot of microbes specifically are able to act in ways that we wouldn't be able to recognize. So as you know, with fungi, you have sort of the merging of different mycorrhizal hyphae that then are able to exchange genetic information and produce entirely new species. You have bacteria that can sort of just ride up alongside each other and swap genes and sort of in horizontal gene transfer become entirely new things. So we have to try and think about, I think, in these systems, we think about these systems in a slightly different way in order to be able to really understand the change and the impact that we're having, which I hope that something like energy can do. Jonathan.
Absolutely brilliant presentation, Jed. Well done. And I think it's very, very interesting and important that we start thinking about the way energy flows through systems, because I don't think it's regarded by the nature conservation lobby, which is sort of where I come from, really, that seriously. It's not understood and it's not widely appreciated. So just a couple of observations, really. One is that you can only unlock this access to the sunshine if you've got, as Sue pointed out, the right mix of nutrients flowing as well. They're like the keys that allow this energy source to be unlocked. And we've become very interested in the flow of phosphorus in forests, for example. Did a very nice little paper, which I totally screwed up all the numbers for and had to be straightened out by a Cambridge academic, on how much phosphorus a pair of ospreys pushes into a forest. So that was one point. It's really important that I don't think you can disentangle, as it were, the energy flows from the flux of phosphorus particularly. I don't think nitrogen is such a big issue because of what everything else does. The main 2 points I was going to raise, one of which leaves you with a question. The first of which was a question that Martha raised, which is about biodiversity. We confound, as it were, biodiversity and use the term interchangeably with nature conservation, whereas nearly all the really interesting nature conservation places that survive are nutrient poor, very nutrient poor, which allows a whole raft of specialist species to survive. And regenerative agriculture, much as I applaud it, I'm a trustee of the Soil Association, so we're really up for all this. The biodiversity that's generated in agricultural soils of the sorts you've just described is pretty above ground. In terms of nature conservation, it's pretty dull stuff. You know, it's supporting a lot of widespread species which are declining fast and need a lot of help. But they're not the rare orchids, they're not the rare beetles, they're not the rare anything, really, putting it bluntly. So that's just an observation that we really do need to make a distinction between nature conservation, bioenergetics, and nutrient flows, and agricultural ones. The other point, which then leads to a question for you, is that we've been very involved with a farm cluster around here on the chalk. And I'm quite a landscape historian. I go out and potter around and look for evidence of past land use. The really obvious land use change in my lifetime has been the abandonment of livestock farming. So you go in all the fields around here, the hedges are thick and quite nice, but rather nutrient rich, but they're full of abandoned cattle troughs and gates and things. To put the livestock back into lots of these areas is sociologically and economically really difficult. So my question I think that you might be able to pose is, because I totally agree with you, we need to eat far better quality meat at lower levels, going down that road in this household. But how much grazing do you actually require to support the sorts of vibrant below ground livestock, I'm going to steal that term, in your emergent property that is soil, which is another term I've already stolen. And how much livestock grazing do you need? And does it have to be cattle, or can it be sheep, or can it be llamas? Basically, we really do need to know a little bit more about the quantity and the quality of grazing, because it's so damn difficult to put back into an agricultural landscape that's frankly run by old men who don't want to change and really would rather be sitting in a tractor than chasing cattle and sheep around in the middle of the night.
Yeah, no, thank you, John. So some really interesting points there, and yeah, no, I firstly on just on the first point, I definitely appreciate that, you know, that this is sort of it is an action that obviously is trying to diversify the landscape, but having a homogeneous action undertaken on a wide scale area produces lots of sort of homogeneous results.
Yeah.
Whether or not that homogeneity is sort of the common species versus the rare ones, etc.
It's one of the reasons why quarries are so interesting.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. So I would say that this is just looking at one small scale example of the possible sort of land uses in terms of the matrix that we need to produce. And that I would love to apply this and understand this in different environments that we 100% need and sort of need in the part of that matrix of all the cores and the corridors. For the second point, livestock is a really big issue. I mean, in particular parts of the country, they are nearly non-existent now. So, for example, the east of the country, it's very difficult to find a cow or a sheep or something to be able to provide that nutrient addition. There's a few approaches that I've seen that possibly could work on this. The first is flying flocks. So there are increasing numbers of flying flocks around the country, specifically of sheep that are taken to sites and they spend a period of time there. And that could be something that is done in future. However, obviously there are other issues with this. I think we sort of need to more structurally look at farming in this country and understand how we're doing it. You know, a lot of that very large scale farming, especially in East Anglia, is done by massive corporates. And that most of, as Sue has just said, yeah, a lot of that livestock is basically been endorsed, and it's sort of been made into sort of factory level farming. So we need to think about the structure of farming, and that's something that I would advocate for in sort of this land use change and this creation of this different matrix across the landscape that needs to be done. There is also the possibility of not using livestock, although it is the easiest thing to do. So I know, for example, Ian Tolhurst in South Oxfordshire is a stock-free vegan in his farming system and will utilize chipped sallow. So he grows a stand of willow on his site that he will chip every year and spread a very thin layer of across the soil, which does have impacts on sort of soil organic matter levels, which is he anecdotally has said is quite successful. So that is also a possibility. It's about having some sort of organic matter addition at some point in the cycle. In terms of the frequency of that addition, he does that on a yearly basis, for example. But I think that is something that might need to be adapted to local needs and conditions. So, for example, in the Cotswolds at FarmEd, we're currently actually using sheep. So we are sort of diversifying the types of livestock that we're using those organic matter additions with, and do often advocate for following on with different animals to try and change the nutrient density of deposition and also of the type of grazing action. They all have different types of grazing action. So there are sort of multiple different ways that you might want to do that. I believe at the conditions at FarmEd last year, the sheep were probably run across maybe 3 or 4 times over the course of the spring and the summer. So not a huge number, but just enough to sort of increase the nutrient levels.
That's very much in keeping with the tradition on these downland locations where the sheep were fundamentally about the husbandry of the arable. They shifted nutrients from the downlands to the arable, and the ratio of downland to arable was basically broken up in the 19th to 20th, late 19th, early 20th century by modern agricultural techniques. But until then, sheep were basically there about agricultural husbandry, and wool and meat was a byproduct. The shepherd was one of the best paid employees on the farm. It's very interesting because I think the modern version of that is that if you want to go into farming and you don't have any capital, managing a movable sheep flock with electric fencing is about the only thing you can afford to do unless you marry into it. So it's a very interesting game indeed, I think. And it's all very relevant to how we then address nature conservation as opposed to the environmental role of biodiversity in a landscape that's basically an archipelago of island biogeography now. It's a very curious sort of setup. You're trying to replicate things you cannot replicate because you don't have the shepherds and the thousands of sheep and the traditional markets and what have you.
Yeah, I think that also
very good study. Well done. I'm going to shut up now.
No problem. But I honestly, I think that also speaks well to this idea that we need sort of lively rural communities and peopled landscapes that are going to do this work. And then hopefully this can tie in with that too. Sorry, I do know that people are dropping off because we are a little bit over time, but I'd love to get to the last two questions. So Victoria, if you...
Well, I always feel quite humble following on from Jonathan because he's terrifyingly in on all of this. And actually, he raised a couple of questions, which actually I find myself talking to farmers about, and that I think it's an enormous challenge for them to relate to all of this and how they improve what they're doing. And actually, I think one of the biggest problems that I keep pointing out to them is that most academics don't seem to be able to agree what improved biodiversity is. And so that I think makes huge problems with metrics and that sort of thing. So that's why I'm very interested in what you're doing to see whether the cluster could perhaps find a way to measure how they can, alongside the regenerative agriculture they're doing, improve biodiversity as well. And that's why an awful lot of what Jonathan's just described is massively relevant. So the question I actually had was in relation, so obviously you described an 8-year rotation, but you only looked at 2 years. And so presumably everything shifted along one plot in those 2 years. So the question I had was, did you get any sense about how, if you were to rotate, do the full year rotation, it might affect your outcomes? That's probably a very difficult question to answer, but I don't know enough about the science to take a view, but I'd just be interested to know if you have a view.
Yeah, no problem. And apologies if everyone's hearing some weird noises. My dog is next to me and he's getting a bit restless. But yes, so firstly, just on the what is improved biodiversity, I'm really glad you sort of raised that because we've been thinking about that as a centre quite a lot. And obviously that looks very different in terms of the place and space and sort of obviously the conditions that the climate are now sort of creating for us. We think about that as a centre as sort of monitoring trajectories of change in terms of the abundance and diversity and the energy that are flowing through systems and measuring again and again in specific places to understand the change over time and hopefully having sort of our upward direction. And that is sort of as far as we can sort of go in terms of what is improved biodiversity, because it is really, as you say, difficult to define. On the second part of the question, we looked at parts of the rotation. We weren't able to look at, as you say, sort of all 8 years because it was too much of an undertaking. But we hope that the way that we set it up by looking at sort of 3 of those points has basically condensed a lot of that down. So there's usually 4 years of the herbal lay, 2 or 3 years of cropping, and another year of birdseed mix. So we didn't look at the birdseed mix because that was more of a CSS sort of scheme. We looked at one of those years of cropping, which did move on a year, as you said, in the middle, and then 2 years of the herbal lay, so sort of the bookends, the young and the mature. Now, what we can start to see actually is that FarmEd are producing a crop from this rotation, and they produce a heritage wheat that they mill into a flour and etc. And they do have statistics on the yields that they have versus what they're taking off of the control plot. Now, these yields are slightly less, that's true. And I would say that that talks to sort of the need for a larger food system transformation in terms of the reduction in waste and an efficient sort of distribution of a lot of our food. But there's also other products that are produced from having, for example, a larger crop, taller plants, etc., more straw. There are other things that can be used in different parts of the farm that can be utilised for that diverse farming system as well. Now, I know that there are other farming systems. I know that Ian Tolhurst in South Oxfordshire would say that his cropping is as productive, if not more productive, than his utilisation of intensified or sort of chemical products. More anecdotally, I know at FarmEd that we're not seeing huge losses, but they are lower. So it needs to be thought about in a way that we can transform our food systems to be more efficient for sort of the uses that we need. But yeah, hopefully that's something that we can understand further. And there are certain further improvements that we also want to make to systems like this. So I know that something that's a bit of a crux of understanding at the moment is how to terminate the herbal ley properly in order to put the crops in and make sure that you can don't have too much bleed through, for example, of some of the more hardy plants like chicory, which are very tall and very hardy and are very good at sort of persisting in the soil, even if you subsoil or do something to them. And I hope that sort of trying to optimize some of these processes will help sort of retain all of the nutrients and structure in the soil that could produce better cropping outcomes.
Yeah, and then of course, when you've done all that, you've got to make sure that the numbers add up and you're not losing so much money that you can't make the thing function. Anyway, on that note, thank you.
No problem. And actually, it's important to mention because a lot of regenerative farmers that I speak to now say that even though they're producing a lower yield, they're creating better revenues because they're not spending money on fertilizers and pesticides, which obviously have skyrocketed in price recently. But yeah, hopefully the sort of economics of that does sort of work out. Sorry, last one is Nigel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jed. Love the clarity of your talk, really did, especially the soil health and biology message. The question I have is a taxonomic citizen science one, which we've discussed before. Who and how do you identify all the micro, meso, and macro actors in each black box? And looking to the future, how might that change to scale up as a citizen science project? Not for answering now, but I'd love to discuss that with you more.
Yeah, I would love to think about that more and obviously try and either impart the skills or the knowledge for lots of others to be able to get involved to do that or find novel ways that we might be able to do that in future. But yeah, there's a lot of very specialist sort of skills needed that we utilized in this project and hopefully maybe we can chat about this a bit more, how we can streamline this down to sort of make a more efficient and possible sort of widespread way to do some of this work across the country.
I really believe you're right at the frontier on this at the moment, and it's really exciting.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I look forward to chatting about it more together. So thank you very much. Brilliant. Well, yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it. And yeah, if anybody would like to talk at any other point to sort of about any issues or anything I want to discuss, please just send me an email. I'm really happy to chat. I'm in the Levy Centre. My details are on the website.